The day is over. Whatever it held, it's behind you now. Tonight's story isn't just for sleep. It's for softness, for slowing down. Subscribe if you'd like more gentle moments like this one. And let me know, when do you usually listen to these stories? After the breakup, I moved into the smallest apartment I could find, not out of drama, but because I genuinely didn't need much space anymore. It was tucked above an old tailor's shop on a quiet street with a leaning row of sycamores and no visible house numbers. You wouldn't know the building was residential unless you'd been told. The staircase creaked under my weight like it hadn't held anyone in a while, and when the landlord handed me the keys, he only said, "It's peaceful. No one ever complains." The room was plain. One window facing an alley, a small radiator under the sill, and a bed that didn't quite fit the wall, so one side floated slightly crooked. It was the kind of place where your footsteps echoed softly back at you, like the walls were still getting used to company. I unpacked slowly, not because there was much to unpack, but because the silence welcomed me like an old friend, and I didn't feel the need to rush. The first night, I lay down early. The kind of early that isn't really about sleep, but about pausing, just resting next to the quiet until your thoughts slow down. That's when I noticed them. Tiny, faint glows on the ceiling, like the plastic stars kids stick up in their rooms, except these moved slowly, not spinning or blinking, just shifting, rearranging themselves in quiet patterns that I didn't recognize. I blinked, sat up, looked again. They weren't always there, or maybe they were, just waiting for the lights to go out. I watched them for a long while that night, longer than I realized, and I fell asleep not with answers but with a calm curiosity in my chest, the kind that feels like an exhale after holding something in for too long. Over the next few days, the stars became part of my nightly routine. I didn't mention them to anyone. I wasn't seeing anyone anyway. And even if I had, I wasn't sure how to describe them without making it sound strange. But they changed each night, subtly, like constellations drawn from memory instead of maps. Once I saw what looked like a boat, then a ladder, then something that could have been a cat curled on a rooftop. They weren't brilliant or glowing like LEDs, more like the last glimmer of fireflies fading in the dark. The more I watched them, the more I began to feel like they were watching me too, not in any frightening way, but more like the way a grandmother watches a sleeping child, quiet, patient, with the knowledge that presence alone can be a kind of love. I started to sleep better, not all at once, but slowly, like my body remembered something it had forgotten about: safety. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for, really. The room felt safe, like it had been waiting for me. And when you find a place like that, even if you don't know why you stay, at least for a while, the second night was quieter than the first, though I couldn't tell you exactly why. Maybe it was the way the rain had started falling sometime after midnight, not enough to make puddles, just a soft, even tapping on the window pane, like someone gently reminding you that the world is still moving out there, even if you're not. I left the window cracked open a little, letting in that faint, earthy smell of wet pavement and early summer leaves. The air felt cooler on my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone or fill the silence with a screen. I just let it all be. That's something I've had to relearn, how to let things be. In the months leading up to the breakup, everything felt like it needed managing, steering, controlling. Even silence had become something to fight off. But here, in this quiet, unfamiliar room with a ceiling that shimmered faintly like a night sky made for one, I didn't feel the weight of those old reflexes. I let my breathing slow. I listened to the way the radiator clicked every few minutes like an old man settling into sleep. And then, like the night before, the stars began to shift. This time they moved slower, almost lazily, forming a pattern I couldn't quite recognize until it settled into something unmistakable. A bird, not in flight, but perched, wings folded, head slightly turned, like it was listening for something. I remember thinking how odd it was, that it didn't feel random. It felt like the room was trying to tell me something, not with words, but with memory. And just like that, I was 10 years old again, sitting on the porch steps of my grandfather's cottage in the countryside, wrapped in one of his wool blankets, watching a bird just like that, one sitting atop a fence post in the fading light. He had told me, in that low, slow voice of his, birds don't need to understand the whole sky. They just trust the next breeze. I'd forgotten that moment entirely until now. Isn't it strange how memory works? How something you thought was long gone can rise to the surface just because a shape in the dark reminded you where it was buried? I don't know if the stars were really forming a bird or if my mind was stitching things together in the dark, but it didn't matter. It brought me back to something quiet and good, and I think there's value in that. Sometimes we need to be reminded of who we used to be, not because we want to go back, but because there's something worth carrying forward. That night, I whispered a quiet thank you into the dark, not really knowing who I was thanking, just feeling that gratitude needed a voice. The stars shifted again before I fell asleep, fading into something softer, less defined. I didn't try to name the shape. I just watched. And then I closed my eyes and let myself drift, not with resistance, but with trust. You're safe here, I remember thinking. It's okay to rest. Tea was a Thursday morning, I think, though time had started to feel less like a calendar and more like a soft flow I could float inside. The kind of morning that smells like warm fabric and early sunlight. Not dramatic, just quietly alive. I had planned to stay in, maybe make some coffee and read through a book I'd left half finished on the nightstand. But as I stepped out to throw away some trash, I heard the voice for the first time. "You walk like someone who just got here," it said, slightly muffled through the half-open door of the shop below. I turned, and there he was, the tailor. Or at least I assumed he was a man in his 60s, with a tape measure draped around his neck like a necklace he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it was there. His glasses hung low on his nose, and his eyes, though small, were kind. The kind of eyes that had measured a lot of lives by hand lengths and shoulder seams. "Just moved in upstairs," I said, and he gave a small nod, like that was answer enough. "You sleep all right?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded too. "Actually, yeah. Better than I have in months." "That room's got a way of doing that," he said, half turning back into the shop. "She doesn't like to be loud, but she notices things." Before I could ask what that meant, he disappeared behind a rack of half-finished suits. I lingered for a second longer than necessary, feeling the strangeness of what he'd said settle into me like a loose thread, is there, but can't quite find. Back upstairs, the sunlight had moved across the floor, catching the edge of my coffee mug and lighting it up like stained glass. I sat beside the window and let the light wash over me, thinking about how some people speak like they're passing you a secret, not a sentence. The tailor had that way about him. That night, I noticed the stars above me were quieter, fewer, like they'd drawn back to watch from a distance. I don't know if it was just my mood, or if the room was responding to something subtle in me. But the change was real. Where before there had been shifting patterns and faint shapes, now there were just a handful of soft glimmers, hovering like quiet thoughts. One of them flickered gently near the edge of the ceiling, and I followed it with my eyes until I felt my chest loosen, not with emotion exactly, but with a kind of settling. I realized I hadn't thought about her all day. Not out of avoidance, but because something else was beginning to fill that space. Something slower, quieter, more my own. Healing doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just the absence of a tightness you forgot you were carrying. The stars that night didn't make a shape I could name. They just drifted a little, like ripples in a very still pond. And as I lay there, listening to the hum of the city breathing faintly in the distance, I felt that same presence again, like someone sitting beside me, not asking anything of me, just being there. And maybe that's all we need. Sometimes, to be allowed to be incomplete, in peace, to have a space that asks nothing but honesty. I turned over and let sleep come without ceremony, knowing it would come gently, the way it had been lately, like a tide returning to shore, not to take anything away, but to bring something forgotten back home. A few days later, or maybe a week, I couldn't really tell anymore. I was dusting near the far wall, behind a low bookshelf the previous tenant must have left, when I noticed a faded line of writing just above the baseboard, barely visible, like something painted over long ago but never fully erased. It was only a name, Lena. No last name, no date, no explanation. Just 4 letters, written in the kind of looping, slanted script that belongs to someone who once believed in keeping journals or writing long letters by hand. I stared at it for a while, wondering who she was, how long ago she'd lived here, and what she might have seen in the same ceiling. I now fell asleep beneath every night. I didn't try to paint over it. It felt like it belonged there, like a quiet ghost who asked for nothing, just to be remembered now and then. That night, I lay in bed watching the stars come back, slow and steady, and I whispered the name aloud once, unsure why. Lena. It felt like the room exhaled when I said it. The stars above shifted gently, pulling into a shape that looked almost like a spiral or a shell. I couldn't tell if it was me projecting meaning onto the lights or if something deeper, older was stirring. I thought again of what the tailor had said. She doesn't like to be loud, but she notices things. Maybe this room had seen many people pass through, carrying their silences and sorrows like suitcases. Maybe the stars were not mine alone, but a thread carried forward from those who had come before. That idea didn't frighten me. In fact, it made the space feel warmer, like I was part of something ongoing, something that didn't need to be understood to be real. I started to talk to the room sometimes, not in the way you talk to another person, but more like the way you hum to yourself when you're cooking or folding laundry. Little pieces of thought, spoken out loud to fill the stillness. I told her about the park nearby, how I saw a child chasing pigeons and laughed for the first time in weeks. I told her about the letter I never sent to my ex, and how it still sat in the drawer unopened, unsent. I even read a page of a book out loud one evening, just to see how the words sounded when spoken into this quiet. The room never answered, of course, but the silence changed. It became something that held me rather than pressed against me. One night, I woke up briefly just after 3 a.m., not startled, but aware like something had gently tapped my thoughts. The stars above had rearranged themselves again, but this time into something that looked unmistakably like an open door. I lay there, eyes wide in the dark, not frightened, just full of a calm awe, the kind you feel when standing in an old cathedral or looking out at the sea in winter. A sense that you are small but not alone, that you are allowed to be unsure, to still be becoming. I didn't move. I just watched. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't in years. Permission. Not from someone else. From within, permission to let go of the narratives I'd been clinging to, the story of failure, the pressure to move on, the illusion that healing had to look a certain way. The stars slowly shifted again, the doorway melting into a new shape I couldn't name, and that was enough. I turned onto my side, feeling the weight in my chest soften once again. Whatever this place was, whatever it had once been, I was grateful for it. And sometimes that's the only prayer you need. A whispered thank you to the dark. A slow breath in the quiet, a name half remembered, but never quite lost. One afternoon, as I was coming back from the corner store with a paper bag full of tea and oranges, I found a small envelope resting on the top step of the staircase. It wasn't addressed, and it wasn't sealed, just folded over once, neatly, with the word upstairs written on the front in soft pencil. Inside was a small card, nothing fancy, and a single sentence in narrow handwriting. If you'd ever like to talk, the tailor has a kettle on around 5. That was all. No name, no push, just a quiet door left slightly open. I held the note in my hand longer than necessary, standing there in the hallway as the afternoon light leaned across the banister, warm and golden the way only certain hours managed to be. At 5 that day I went downstairs. Not because I felt lonely, not really, but because something in the gesture, the softness of it, made me want to say yes to it. The shop was quiet, with the smell of fabric and steam lingering in the air like an old melody. He didn't greet me like someone surprised, just gestured with a small nod toward the back, where a kettle was already whistling gently. "It's chamomile," he said, pouring into 2 mismatched cups. That room upstairs, she likes chamomile. We sat on the steps behind the shop, 2 chipped mugs between us, no urgency in the silence. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer stories. But after a while, he said, "You've met her, haven't you? The stars." I didn't answer right away, just looked down into the steam curling from my cup. "I think so," I said, "but I don't know what they are." He nodded, as though that was the right answer. Most people try to name them. It never sticks. They're not for naming. They're for listening. We sat a little longer, sipping slowly. I told him about the name I'd found Lena, and the shape of the bird, the open door, the quiet that had changed texture somehow. He listened like someone who had all the time in the world. "Lena was here once," he said softly. eyes resting on the dusky sky beyond the alley. A long time ago, she used to hum while she sewed, said the stars helped her sleep. His voice didn't carry sadness, just memory. Like a page being turned gently. Do they change for everyone? I asked. He shrugged, then smiled a small, knowing smile that didn't need to be explained. They change when you do. That night, back in my room, I sat in the armchair instead of lying in bed. I watched the stars as they returned, not as a pattern this time, but as movement, like a tide or a slow dance. They didn't form anything I could name, but they moved with a kind of grace that made me feel witness, like my quiet was being mirrored back to me. I thought about the tailor, about the kettle and the folded note, about how kindness doesn't always arrive in grand ways. Sometimes it comes as tea at 5, or a sentence left gently at your door. I leaned back, exhaled, and whispered again into the stillness. Thank you. The stars pulsed once, softly. Maybe it was my imagination. Or maybe it was how this room speaks, in pauses, in light, in memory. And if that's true, then maybe I'm learning a new language, one that doesn't rush, one that waits for you to be ready, one that says again and again, you don't have to fix everything tonight. You're safe here. Take your time. That night, sometime just after midnight, I woke up with a memory I hadn't touched in years, the smell of toast. Not the idea of it, but the full sense memory. Slightly burned edges, warm butter, the way it fills a small kitchen when everything else is quiet. It hit me so clearly that I half expected to find someone in my kitchenette downstairs preparing a late-night snack. But the apartment was empty. Still, the stars above were dimmer than usual, as though they were waiting. I didn't feel lonely, just aware of the past, of the space I occupied now, and of the small echoes that live inside us. I sat up and went to the window, not to look for anything, just to stand near something real. The night outside was cool and blue, the kind of blue that only appears when the world is half asleep. I rested my arms on the windowsill and let the air move past my skin, slow and familiar. The memory of toast didn't come alone. It brought her with it, not in the sharp, painful way it used to, but in something softer, like the way you remember the weight of a coat you no longer wear. I thought of the first apartment we lived in together, too small, always a little drafty, but filled with the kind of laughter that comes easiest when you're still figuring each other out. She used to make toast at odd hours, whenever she couldn't sleep. Said the smell made the dark feel less empty. I never understood it back then, but I think I do now. I sat back on the bed, pulled the blanket over my legs, and looked up. The stars above me were moving again, but not quickly. They moved like someone gently flipping through the pages of a well-loved book. And for the first time, I didn't try to interpret the shapes. I just let them be what they were. Quiet, moving light. Something constant, but never the same. Strange, isn't it? How the heart holds on to things? Even after you've cleaned the closets, deleted the photos, moved on in all the visible ways, the small things remain. Like toast at midnight. like the sound of her laugh through a closed bathroom door. I didn't cry. Not this time. I just remembered. Fully, gently, and maybe that's a kind of healing too. Not the kind that fixes everything, but the kind that stops fighting what was. The stars didn't form a picture that night. They shimmered lightly, like candlelight from a distant window, like someone saying, "I see you," without needing to say more. I turned out the lamp and lay back down, arms folded loosely across my chest. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but full of something calm and steady. Outside, a breeze passed through the sycamore branches, and inside, the stars continued their slow, silent drift. I let them carry me, not into dreams exactly, but into a kind of soft, forgetting the kind where you're not letting go to forget, but letting go to make space. And in that space, I felt something return. Not her, not the past, but me. A little more of me. The part that could rest. The part that could feel warmth again, even in the middle of the night. There was a drawer in the kitchen that never quite closed, the middle one, just under the countertop, with a small metal handle that clinked when you touched it. I hadn't paid it much attention in the weeks since I moved in. It was the kind of drawer you toss receipts into, or rubber bands, or that one screwdriver you always misplace. But one evening, while waiting for the kettle to finish its slow, steady boil, I pulled it open, absent-mindedly, and noticed a thin envelope tucked flat against the back, half covered by an old cork coaster. It didn't have a stamp, just a name written in faded blue ink, "To whoever needs it." I stood there for a long moment, fingers resting on the paper, not quite sure whether I wanted to be the person who needed it, or if I already was. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once, soft with age. The message was short, almost too simple. This room held me when I thought I was unraveling. If you're here, maybe it's your turn. Just breathe. Let it hold you too. No signature, no date, nothing more. But I stood in that small kitchen with the chip tile floor and the hum of the kettle growing louder, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not sadness, not even nostalgia. Just that deep, steady warmth of knowing you're not the first to feel the way you feel. That others have walked the same soft silence, watched the same shifting stars, and left behind small offerings, not answers, but kindness. I placed the note back exactly where I found it, under the coaster, because something about it didn't feel like it was mine to take, more like it belonged to the room itself. That night, the stars above moved in quiet arcs, slower than usual, like they were remembering something too. They didn't form anything I could clearly name, but they pulsed gently, in clusters not bright, just alive. I watched them until my eyes grew heavy, then reached out and touched the wooden headboard, grounding myself in something solid. And as I did, I whispered, maybe more to the room than to myself, "Thank you for holding me too." The air felt warmer after that. Not physically, but in that subtle way rooms shift when they recognize someone is finally listening. It made me think of something my grandmother once told me. Some places don't forget you, even long after you're gone. I hadn't understood it then. I was too young, too distracted. But now, as I lay beneath a ceiling of quiet stars, and beside a drawer that wouldn't close quite right, I began to. Healing isn't a single thing. It's a collection of small mercies. A note in a drawer, tea on the landing, the comfort of a name you'll never know. And somewhere between all that, I realized I'd stopped marking the days. Not because I was lost, but because I no longer needed to count distance from where I'd been. I was simply here, in this room, breathing, resting, becoming someone new, or maybe just remembering who I'd always been beneath the noise. I never really decided to leave the room. There wasn't a moment of packing up with fanfare, no bittersweet goodbye in the mirror. Life just shifted, as it does. A job offer came quiet and unexpected, like most real changes in a city not too far away. And the idea of movement didn't scare me anymore. I hadn't felt that in a long time. It was as if the stillness of the room had done its work, not by fixing me, but by letting me unravel safely, letting me rest without explanation, letting me forget the rush. In the last few days before I left, I spent more time near the window, not doing anything in particular, just sitting, watching the street below, the sycamores swaying softly, the tailor's door opening and closing like the rhythm of an old breath. He didn't say much when I told him I'd be moving out, just nodded and said, "She's good at goodbyes." I wasn't sure if he meant the room or someone else, but I nodded too. It felt true either way. I didn't sleep the last night, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to miss it. The stars appeared slowly, the way they always did, and this time they made something unmistakable. A small figure sitting by a window, hands folded, watching the night. Watching, not waiting. And I realized it was me. Or maybe not me exactly, but a memory of me left here gently, like a bookmark in a favorite chapter. The stars shimmered around that shape, and I knew then that whatever this room was, however it had come to be what it was, it would hold that image the way it had held. Lena and the note and the quiet sorrow of all the others who came through with hearts in need of soft places. I left the bed made, though not perfectly, just enough. I cleaned the dishes, watered the plant on the sill that somehow survived in silence, and left a small envelope in the drawer that didn't close. It didn't say much, just a few lines. If you're here, maybe you needed this too. The stars are kind. Trust them. I locked the door with a steady hand. One breath in, one out. The street outside felt new. Not in the way new things usually do, but in the way a familiar place feels when you've changed enough to see it differently. I passed by the tailor's window one last time. He wasn't there, but the light was on, and I took that as his goodbye. And maybe hers too. Wherever I live next, I doubt the ceiling will glow. I doubt the stars will rearrange themselves in the dark. But maybe, just maybe, that isn't the point. Maybe some rooms stay with you even after you leave them. Not in the walls or the furniture, but in the quiet you carry forward. In the way you learn to breathe slower. In the way you learn to sit with yourself and not flinch. I don't need stars to shift above me anymore to know I'm changing. I can feel it in the way my feet touch the ground. In the way silence no longer feels like a wound. And tonight, wherever you are, if you're still awake, I want you to know it's okay to rest. The world can wait a little. You've come far. And there is more ahead, but not all at once. You're safe here. Even if here is a memory, even if here is just you and the quiet that stayed,